There's a moment right before someone lies to an empath where the empath already knows, not suspects, not wonders, knows. And the strange, unsettling part is that it happens before a single false word has even left the other person's mouth. This isn't mysticism. It isn't some vague, unfalsifiable claim about energy or vibes, even though that's often how it gets dismissed by people who've never experienced it from the inside. What's actually happening is one of the most sophisticated, least understood forms of human perception. And once you understand the mechanism behind it, you'll never think about lying or being lied to the same way again. Let's start with what a lie actually is, structurally, because most people misunderstand this completely. A lie isn't just false information, it's a mismatch, a gap between what someone's words are saying and what their body, their tone, their timing, their eyes are simultaneously communicating. Most people don't consciously register that gap. They hear the words, they process the words, and unless the mismatch is glaring, they move on, taking the sentence at face value because that's the path of least cognitive effort. Empaths don't process this way. And the reason they don't is not magic. It's neurology, forged in most cases through years of necessity. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. Most empaths didn't develop this heightened perception because they were simply born more sensitive, full stop, end of story. Many developed it because somewhere in their history, often early, often in a household or relationship where safety depended on accurately predicting someone else's mood before it turned dangerous, they had to become fluent in reading microsignals long before they had the vocabulary to explain what they were doing. A shift in tone that preceded an outburst, a too quick smile that meant something underneath it wasn't right, a pause half a second longer than it should have been. Children who grow up around unpredictable, volatile, or manipulative adults learn to read faces and voices with the precision of a lie detector. Not because it's a fun party trick, but because their nervous system correctly calculated that missing the signal could cost them something real. That skill doesn't switch off in adulthood. It becomes the operating system. So when an empath tells you they just know when someone's lying, what's actually happening underneath that simple sentence is an enormously complex, largely unconscious process of pattern recognition running in real time. They're not reading your words, they're reading the 17 things happening around your words. The fraction of a second delay before you answer a question you should have an instant response to. The way your voice rises in pitch just slightly when the story gets to the part that isn't true. The unconscious gesture, a hand moving toward the face, a shift in weight, a sudden stillness where there used to be normal, relaxed movement that leaks out exactly when the words being spoken require more effort to construct than the truth would have. This is called incongruence, and it is, without question, one of the most reliable signals of deception that exists. Far more reliable, ironically, than most of what people think of as classic lying tells, like avoiding eye contact, which is actually a poor indicator on its own and can just as easily signal social anxiety or cultural difference as dishonesty. What actually gives a liar away isn't any single behavior in isolation. It's the mismatch between the emotional tone a story should carry and the emotional tone it's actually being delivered with. Someone recounting a genuinely upsetting event, but doing it with a voice that's slightly too smooth, slightly too rehearsed, missing the natural disfluency that real, unprocessed emotion tends to produce. That gap is where the truth actually lives, and it's exactly the frequency an empath's nervous system has spent a lifetime learning to detect. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because there's a second layer to this that goes beyond simply reading behavioral cues, something closer to what researchers call emotional contagion, the automatic, largely involuntary process by which we absorb and mirror the emotional states of people around us. Most people experience this in mild, everyday ways: catching someone's yawn, feeling your own mood dip slightly around a person who's anxious without consciously choosing to. Empaths experience this process turned up to an intensity most people never have to manage, which means when someone lies to them, they're not just observing the incongruence from the outside, analytically. They're feeling it. A kind of dissonance settles into their own body, a tightness, a wrongness, a static that doesn't match the calm, confident story being told. This isn't a metaphor. It's the physical sensation of picking up on someone else's internal conflict before that conflict has been consciously acknowledged by the person creating it. This is why empaths will often describe knowing someone is lying before they can articulate why. They'll say things like, something felt off, or I don't know, I just had a bad feeling. And this gets dismissed constantly by people who prize logical, articulable evidence over embodied perception, as though a feeling that can't yet be fully explained in words must therefore be less valid than one that can. But the feeling isn't coming from nowhere. It's coming from an enormous amount of real-time data processing. Tone, timing, micro-expression, breath pattern, emotional incongruence happening faster than conscious language can keep up with. The words arrive later, if they arrive at all. The knowing comes first because the perception was never actually verbal to begin with. This is also precisely why lying to an empath is such a uniquely bad strategy, even though so many people, narcissists especially, try it anyway, over and over, convinced that this time, with enough confidence, enough charm, enough carefully rehearsed detail, they'll finally get away with it. What they don't understand, because they experience the world so differently, is that confidence and charm are not what an empath is actually evaluating. A narcissist's entire skill set is built around performing the content of sincerity, the right words, the right tone, the right amount of eye contact, all consciously or semi-consciously calibrated to be persuasive. But performance, no matter how skilled, still requires effort, and effort, no matter how well it's disguised, produces exactly the kind of incongruence an empath's nervous system has been trained since childhood to detect. This is the trap that so many manipulators walk directly into without ever understanding why it isn't working the way it usually does with everyone else. They lie to an empath the same way they'd lie to anyone, with polish, with practiced detail, with just enough emotional inflection to sound convincing on the surface, and it lands with everyone around them except the one person whose entire nervous system is built specifically to catch exactly what they're doing. And because the empath often can't immediately explain the why behind their certainty in a way that satisfies someone demanding hard evidence, the manipulator will frequently double down, escalate the performance, add more detail, more emotion, more conviction, which almost always backfires completely because overcorrection is its own kind of tell. A person telling the truth doesn't usually need to keep adding evidence nobody asked for. A person lying often can't stop themselves from doing exactly that. And this is where the story gets genuinely dangerous, not for the empath, but for the person doing the lying. Because once an empath has caught the pattern once clearly, undeniably, something in how they relate to that person changes permanently, whether they say anything about it out loud or not. They don't need a confession. That's the part liars never expect. And it's the part that unravels them the most once they realize it's true. An empath who has caught the incongruence once doesn't require the other shoe to drop, doesn't need documented proof, doesn't need the liar to eventually slip up and admit it outright. The knowing already happened. Everything after that is just the world, slowly, catching up to a truth the empath's body registered the moment it occurred. This is why so many manipulators find themselves genuinely baffled by an empath's sudden shift in behavior, a coolness that appears seemingly out of nowhere, a withdrawal of warmth that has no obvious external trigger they can point to, a new, careful distance in a relationship that used to feel completely open. They'll ask, sometimes with real confusion, Did I do something? And the honest answer is yes, they did, weeks or months ago, in a moment so small the liar themselves may have already forgotten it. A slightly too smooth explanation for where they were, a story about a friend that didn't quite track, a reaction to a question that came a half second too fast, too rehearsed, too eager to close the topic before it could be examined further. The empath filed it, not consciously, not as an accusation, but as data, one more piece of evidence in a pattern their nervous system had already begun quietly assembling. Here's what makes this especially devastating for narcissists specifically, more than for an ordinary person who might tell an occasional white lie. Narcissists lie more frequently and often more elaborately than most people because lying serves a very specific function for them beyond simply avoiding a single uncomfortable consequence. It protects the curated image, the performance, the version of themselves they need the world, and often themselves, to believe in. Which means an empath in a relationship with a narcissist isn't catching one isolated lie, they're catching a pattern, a near constant low hum of incongruence running underneath almost every interaction, because so much of what a narcissist presents is, in some form, a performance calibrated for effect rather than a transparent expression of what's actually true. For a while, most empaths override this signal. This is the part of the story that matters most. If you're an empath listening to this and recognizing the pattern in your own life, because it explains something that might otherwise feel like a personal failure, you almost certainly knew on some level far earlier than you let yourself act on it. And the reason you didn't act on it immediately isn't because your perception failed you. It's because you were taught, both by the specific person lying to you and by a broader culture that prizes hard, articulable, defensible evidence over embodied knowing, to distrust your own read of a situation in favor of whatever explanation was being offered instead. You're overthinking this. You're too suspicious. I can't believe you'd accuse me of that based on a feeling. Every one of those responses is designed, whether consciously or not, to make you doubt the one tool that was actually working correctly the entire time. This is the real tragedy hiding underneath the empath's gift, and it's worth naming clearly. It was rarely the perception itself that failed. It was the permission to trust it, being surrounded sometimes for years by people who benefited from you. Doubting your own read on a situation trains you to override a signal that was accurate from the very first moment it appeared. And the people who benefit most from that override, narcissists, chronic liars, anyone whose survival depends on maintaining a story that doesn't hold up to close inspection, will actively, sometimes quite deliberately, work to widen the gap between what you know and what you allow yourself to act on. But here's what almost never gets said clearly enough, and it's the part that should change how you think about every uncomfortable feeling you've ever talked yourself out of. The gap between knowing and acting isn't a permanent condition. It's a trained response, which means it can be untrained, the same way any learned pattern can be slowly, deliberately unlearned, with enough practice and enough evidence that trusting yourself doesn't lead to catastrophe the way you were once taught to fear it would. This is where the story turns from something almost eerie, the empath who just knows, into something genuinely practical, something you can actually use. Because the goal was never to become a flawless human lie detector, immune to ever being fooled. That standard is impossible for anyone, empath or not, and holding yourself to it will only produce more self-doubt, not less. The actual goal, the one worth building toward, is closing the gap between the moment your body registers incongruence and the moment you give yourself permission to act on it. Not necessarily with an accusation, not necessarily with a confrontation, but at minimum with a boundary. A little more distance, a little less benefit of the doubt extended automatically, the way it might have been extended before you learned to notice the pattern this closely. This is also, not coincidentally, exactly why narcissists eventually become afraid of empaths who've done this work. Not the empath who catches one lie and lets it slide, hoping it was an anomaly, but the empath who has learned to trust the knowing immediately without needing to argue herself into believing what her own nervous system already confirmed. That empath is nearly impossible to manipulate long term, not because she's cold or suspicious of everyone by default, but because she's stopped requiring external permission to trust perception that has, over years, proven itself reliable again and again. And this is precisely the version of an empath that most manipulators, when they encounter her, will either work exceptionally hard to destabilize, through gaslighting, through slowly reintroducing the old doubt, through insisting her perception is broken, oversensitive, unfair, or more often will simply leave quietly in search of someone whose nervous system hasn't yet learned to catch them the way hers has. Because here's what almost no one says clearly enough about that departure. When it happens, it isn't a loss. It's a filter working exactly the way it was always supposed to. An empath who trusts her own perception doesn't become harder to love. She becomes harder to lie to, which are two entirely different things, even though people who benefit from deception will often try to convince you they're the same. The people who leave when they can no longer get away with dishonesty were never actually staying for you in the first place. They were staying for the version of the relationship where their performance went unquestioned, where the gap between what they said and what was true never had to be examined too closely because you'd been trained to override the discomfort of noticing it. When that gap starts closing, when you stop talking yourself out of what you already know, you're not losing anything real. You're finally seeing clearly who was only ever there for the blind spot. This is the piece worth sitting with the longest because it reframes something that might have felt for years like a burden into something closer to its actual nature. A form of protection you were given, likely far earlier than you ever asked for it, forged in circumstances you didn't choose. The heightened perception that lets you catch a lie before it's finished forming wasn't handed to you as a party trick or a curiosity. It was built piece by piece by a nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are designed to do, learning, adapting, protecting you from harm it had already learned to anticipate. That it also happens to make you nearly impossible for a certain kind of person to successfully deceive is not a coincidence. It's the entire point. And this is where the story arrives at something that matters more than any single lie you've ever caught, more than any specific person whose incongruence gave them away before they even finished their sentence. The knowing was never really about them. It was about you and about a body that learned, long before your conscious mind had the vocabulary to explain it, that survival sometimes depends on trusting a signal nobody else in the room seems to be receiving. Every time you dismiss that signal to keep the peace, to avoid seeming paranoid, to give someone the benefit of the doubt they hadn't remotely earned, you weren't failing yourself. You were doing what you'd been taught to do by people who needed you not to trust it. What changes everything from this point forward isn't becoming more suspicious of the world. It's the opposite, actually. It's becoming secure enough in your own perception that you no longer need external permission to act on it. You don't need someone else to confirm the lie before you're allowed to create distance. You don't need documented proof before you're allowed to trust the tightness in your chest that arrived half a second before the story did. The knowing was always enough. It was only ever the permission that was missing. If you're an empath who has spent years being told you're too sensitive, too suspicious, too quick to read into things that probably meant nothing, I want you to hear this clearly because it's the truth underneath everything we've walked through together. Your body was never wrong. It was collecting data the rest of the room wasn't equipped to gather, running calculations most people never learned to make, and delivering a verdict long before anyone else in the conversation had caught up to what was actually happening. The mistake was never the perceiving. It was ever being convinced by people who benefited from your doubt that the perceiving itself was the problem. It never was. It was, this entire time, the one part of you that was always telling the truth, even when everyone around you was doing everything they could to convince you it wasn't. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.